Hi everyone, it's William. It's the 28th of December 2024. This is the Grand Duke Dmitri 1921 diary series, and we've jumped forward from 28th February to 15th March, which was actually the 2nd of April on the Western calendar. And I have got a possible other project. I'm thinking of it. This is, I've got the diaries of Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, who was Dmitri's great-grandfather, and they were published in Russia. And I would not at all mind doing another series on those. I think of all the Grand Dukes who were serious people and people whom any of us could admire, I would give that #1 spot to Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich. And I would also say it was a pity that he himself was not Russia's Tsar instead of his brother Alexander II. And I like Alexander II, but I think Constantine would have been better. But that's neither here nor there. His diaries were written at a very interesting time in Russian history. They start in 1860, and he was very much involved, and in many ways the necessary catalyst for the period of great reforms, especially the military reforms and the liberation of the serfs. So Alexander II would be given the title the Tsar Liberator, but in a lot of ways it was really Constantine who was behind that. So Dmitri could be proud of his great-grandfather, although I don't know if he knew that, because he expressed great pride in his grandfather, Alexander II, for being the Tsar Liberator. Funny, the two of them were brothers, but Alexander was Dmitri's grandfather and Constantine was his great-grandfather. All right, so a recap. Our last video for the 28th of February was about Dmitri's last day in Denmark. And the most noteworthy thing about it was his meeting with the Dowager Empress and a nice little chat that they had. And I'm a little surprised because that diary entry has not had many views. And usually when another member of the family, like the Dowager Empress or Grand Duchess Ksenia, is part of the diary entry, then those are particularly popular videos. But maybe it's because of the timing with the holidays. And so there was a farewell conversation with Marie-Louise as well, which we don't know what was said. So far, Dmitri hasn't informed us about that. But at any rate, no decisions were made at that time. Our cast this time is not one of thousands or even hundreds or dozens. It's only one person, and that's our old friend Olga, Danish Prince Olga. And we have an interesting word this time that I just want to mention in advance. It's the word, in English, it's palpitant, palpitant, P-A-L-P-I-T-A-N-T, not at all a common word in English, and I gather not at all a common word in Russian as well. In fact, my colleagues in Russia, this was one of the words that they could not make out. And we've all three of us helped each other very much in that respect. I think they have helped me more than I have helped them. But this is one instance where I was able to read the word that they found unreadable. And I think part of the reason for that is not so much that the word was illegible, but that it was unexpected. So who uses the word palpitant? Well, Dmitri, that's who. And they'd already told me in the past when we talked about it that he used quite complex language. He had an extensive vocabulary. He used complex language. He liked to use complex language in their assessment. And we remember how poetic he could be as well, all the way back to when he was a child in 1906. So, yeah, he uses that word, as you'll see. Okay, so we are up to the 15th of March, as I said, 2nd April, 1921, Tuesday. This diary entry was written in Paris. And I'm sure there are some of you out there who remember Dmitri's Paris address, because he starts every Paris diary entry with his address, which is 76 Rue Miromesnil. Sometimes he says Rue de Miromesnil. This time he does not. I honestly don't know which is correct. So he's writing this in Paris. But before he went back to Paris, he had a very significant stop in Berlin, which we'll be talking about because it's quite important. Dates, as always with Dmitri, confuse me. And then there's this issue of not only that he will write something 2 weeks after it happened, which most people don't do in a diary entry, but also because of having the Western calendar and the Russian or Julian calendar. And so this is 15th March on the Julian calendar and 2nd March on the Gregorian calendar. And he's talking about a very specific event in Russia. He's starting to talk about it, which is the Kronstadt uprising or rebellion. And that took place from the 1st to the 18th March. And I think that was still was that the Julian calendar? I'm not sure if the Soviet government used the Gregorian calendar yet or not. I need to find this out, but I think those dates must be the Julian calendar, because the Kronstadt rebellion per se started on the 1st of March and ended on the 18th of March. And in this diary entry, Dmitri writes as though it's still going on. So by the 2nd of April, it would have been over. But if I look at the dates that I have for the Kronstadt rebellion as being on the Julian calendar, then he's right, it still would have been going on. But most of you probably aren't interested in that anyway, forgive me, but I just want to, make sure that I'm covered on that. And this is going to be a long diary entry because I decided it wouldn't make any sense to cut it in two, even though it's long. Okay, and I've already talked for 8 minutes. Here we go. I have so many impressions from the past 2 weeks that I hardly know where to begin or what to tackle. On the way back from Copenhagen, I stopped off in Berlin, and there, of course, formed a lot of impressions. In addition to that, my thoughts are occupied with the extraordinary rumors that are coming out of Russia, and I think I'll start with them. Note the present tense. 2 days before my departure from Denmark, Olga, that eternal optimist, joyfully informed me that very good and palpitant news was coming out of Russia, and that by all indications, things were moving rapidly toward the end of the Soviet regime. Frankly speaking, I was quite skeptical about what Olga had to say. He's always happy to try to see the bright side of things, especially if it will please the person he's talking to. In fact, bits and pieces of information have appeared in the newspapers purporting that desperate unrest is taking root throughout Russia, often turning into open protests against the Commissar's power, leading to riots and the total extermination of those same commissars. But this is not the first time such information has been reported in the press, and I personally have long since ceased to believe it or take it at all seriously. But this time it's turned out to be a little different. Arriving in Berlin the very first day, there was talk about all these rumors being confirmed, and that in Russia, especially in Petrograd and Moscow, a revolution had broken out with the aim of overthrowing the Soviet government. And you know what? I am going to stop there right before he starts talking about Kronstadt. Actually, it does make sense to chop this one in two. So obviously, this is one of the more historical and talking about historical events beyond Dmitri himself. So one of the more historically significant diary entries, and I say that obviously not because we have an eyewitness account from Dmitri or even an accurate account for Dmitri, but because it's historically significant to know what kind of news was reaching people, as well as how people were reacting to it. In general, and in particular, a member of the Romanov dynasty or emigre circles. And yes, how accurate was the foreign press and what kind of things were they covering? And then, as I mentioned, this stop in Berlin, it's almost kind of, maybe I'm being overly dramatic, but it's almost kind of a rendezvous with destiny for Dmitri. We have the thoughts that he's been thinking in Denmark and this great inner conflict and how that is going to be resolved. And this stop in Berlin is going to really be the linchpin of that. Okay, so we'll find out why he decided to go to Berlin, and we'll find out who he was talking to while he was there. And actually, we don't need to wait to find out about that, because I think I've mentioned in the past that the most conservative, or beyond conservative, even radically right-wing members of the Russian emigration were mostly in Germany, and a lot of them in Berlin. So the people that he was talking to in Berlin had that, except for the Germans themselves, of course. The Russians he was with in Berlin had that basic orientation. All right, so what is he talking about in relation to this so-called idea that there's revolution brewing in Russia before the Kronstadt rebellion has even taken place? Dmitri says the newspapers are even reporting desperate unrest taking root throughout Russia, often turning into open protests against the commissars, leading to riots and the total extermination of the commissars. Well, the commissars were not being totally exterminated. That much I can tell you from the get-go, although they were extremely unpopular. And so then he says when he arrived in Berlin on his very first day there, the rumors were confirmed that in Russia, especially in Petrograd and Moscow, a revolution had broken out with the aim of overthrowing the Soviet regime. Well, that's complicated. It's too simplistic to say with the aim of overthrowing the Soviet regime. Yes and no. But there were indeed, in February already, and even before February 1921, there were indeed uprisings throughout Russia. There were peasant uprisings, especially in, where was the place? Tambov province. There were peasant uprisings. There were also, as Dmitri says, there were also uprisings in Petrograd and Moscow. There were strikes and uprisings, mainly proletariat, mainly workers, not people from the former bourgeoisie, but the actual proletariat that the Soviet government purported to be working for, on behalf of, making an ideal state for. Well, they weren't happy. And so there were these, starting in, Moscow came first in mid-February. that was put down relatively easily. And then you had a more difficult situation in Petrograd in late February, with martial law declared, but also the Bolshevik government, the Soviet government, realized that they needed to provide relief to people, food relief. People were not getting enough to eat. There were other issues as well. I really need to resist talking about that at length, but all of that would, by the end of March, would pretty much be finished with. There were also, and this Dmitri and other Russian emigres probably found particularly exciting, was the fact that you were starting to see splinter groups within the Bolshevik Party itself. And the peasant uprisings had been going on for a while. So in Tambov, it'd been going on since 1920, and it would keep going on until 1922. That would be harder to put down. Okay, so we will delay our examination of Kronstadt for when Dmitri starts talking about it himself. And I guess the only other thing I have to say about this diary, part of the diary entry, is that it's a nice contrast between Olga and Dmitri. And I can really understand, I can really see Olga as being the eternal optimist, as Dmitri says. I mean, even in his memoirs about his time in the French Foreign Legion, Olga is just an upbeat guy, no matter what the circumstances. And poor Dmitri had been less cynical about what was going on in Russia to begin with, but then he just had one setback after another when he'd let his hopes soar. All the way back in 1917 when he was in Persia, good news would come in, and all of those hopes were always knocked down and didn't turn out to be correct, and he became more and more disinclined to believe them, and to believe the press in general and what the press was saying. And I get the impression from him that the press was, at least the conservative press, was sort of putting the best face on things, shall we say, and being a little too optimistic, like maybe not as optimistic as Olga, but a little too optimistic. So these two men, they didn't have that in common. But I think that one of the things that made them such great friends, I think, is they both liked to please people. They both had that side to them. They were both capable of being very kind people. I can actually speak more to that with Dmitri than with Olga. I think I'm judging Olga on the basis that he was kind to Dmitri, above and beyond what other members of the family were. And in Dmitri's case, despite some of the times that we've seen him being rather mean and rather petty, he nonetheless had that capacity to be a kind and compassionate man. And that really came out at the end of his life when he was at Schatzalp. And I have more than one account of people who had no reason to sing his praises, who were staff there, who said, this was such a nice man. And I believe them, maybe it was a result of having matured to some extent and left that petty side of him behind, and maybe because of, having to fight for his life and have this very painful, prolonged ordeal that he went to, and seeing other people have the same thing. Maybe, I don't know. But I will say personally, whether you agree or disagree, I find that I like both Olga and Dmitri. So I'll leave it at that. And you may not find this to be your favorite topic within the diaries, but on the other hand, you may, like me, also think, well, this is really good historical text that I can sink my teeth into. So I hope that's the case. definitely come back, because as you can see from this diary entry, it's not just a dry retelling of what is being written in the newspapers, but Dmitri injects his own opinion and his own emotional response to these things into his diary. So I hope to see you next time. Bye.